They stood at the edge of the civilized world, a gravel parking lot surrounded by clean SUVs. The air smelled of hot asphalt and sunscreen. Liam and Chloe, perfect products of the city, were making their final preparations. Everything they carried was new, stiff, and foreign. Liam's hiking boots, advertised with a dynamic ankle support system, were already biting at his heels. Chloe's backpack, made from organic hemp canvas, hung awkwardly from her shoulders. They were toy soldiers preparing for a war they did not understand. Liam spread the crisp new topographic map across the hood of his car. The contour lines undulated like the EKG of an alien world. "Here," he said, his finger tapping the glossy paper. "The official trail loops around here, takes all day, but look." He pointed to a faint, almost non-existent dotted line that cut straight through a dense patch of green. "An old hunter's path, maybe. It'll get us to Silver Falls before dusk. A shortcut." "A real adventure," Chloe said, smiling. Her smile, like everything else about them, was clean and confident. She believed in energy, in intention. She believed that if they entered the forest with respect, the forest would respond with kindness. They ignored the wooden sign at the trailhead. The letters were carved deep, darkened by time and weather. Green Labyrinth National Park. Below it, a smaller metal plate rusted at the corners. Unmarked trail, dangerous. Experienced hikers only, no maintenance. To them, it wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. They stepped across the boundary. The first pine trees greeted them like sentinels. Warm sunlight filtered through the branches. They walked on a soft carpet of pine needles. For the first hour they talked, they laughed. They were conquerors. And then the forest slowly and methodically began to dismantle them. The change was not sudden. It was a deliberate erosion. In the second hour, the trail began to degrade. It was no longer a clear, packed earth path. It began to fray like an old rope. Thick, black roots surfaced from the ground like knuckles of bone, waiting to turn an ankle. The path forced constant choices, left or right of a moss-covered boulder, under or over a fallen log. Every choice felt right, and every choice led them deeper. By the third hour, the sounds of the outside world had vanished completely. No distant cars, no planes overhead. The silence of the forest began to change. It was no longer peaceful. It was a pressure, an absence of sound that was almost physical. The birdsong had ceased. Even the skittering of small creatures in the undergrowth was gone. The only sounds were their own. Liam's labored breathing, the swish of Chloe's pants rubbing together, and the monotonous crunch of their footsteps on the leaf litter. Thirst arrived. Their eco-friendly water bottles were long empty, swallowed by a foolish belief that they would soon find a stream. Now their throats were sandpaper. Liam's tongue felt swollen and dry, sticking to the roof of his mouth. He tried to swallow, but there was nothing to swallow. Each attempt only made the muscles in his throat cramp painfully. Mosquitoes and black flies, drawn to the salt of their sweat, whined incessantly around their faces, crawling into their ears and nostrils. They pushed on for another hour, seeming to get nowhere. They passed a strangely shaped rock, one that looked like a screaming face. 20 minutes later, they passed it again. "We're walking in circles," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "We are not," Liam snapped, his fear manifesting as anger. "It's just another rock that looks the same." But he knew it was a lie. The forest was playing with them. It was bending space, turning a straight line into a trap. As darkness began to fall with an unnatural quickness in this light-starved world, they decided to stop. The fatigue was bone deep. Liam pulled off his boot, a groan escaping his clenched teeth. The blister had burst. The raw pink skin beneath, wet and tender, was now caked with dirt and leaf fragments. Every breath of wind against it was a fresh agony. This wasn't a minor injury, it was an open door for infection. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat in their flimsy tent and listened to the forest. It was no longer silent, it was making sounds. The sharp crack of a twig just beyond their field of vision, a long, slow scraping sound in the undergrowth. The wind whistling through the branches sounded less like wind and more like a malevolent whisper, a language they didn't understand, but whose intent they could feel. The next morning, the real desperation began. They were no longer pretending to follow a trail. They were just heading in a direction they hoped led out. But the forest only grew thicker. Thorn bushes snagged their clothes and scratched their skin, leaving bleeding red lines. Roots hidden beneath the leaf litter became tripwires, constantly sending them sprawling. Around noon on the second day, at the lowest point of their exhaustion and dehydration, they smelled it. A sweet, nauseating odor, the smell of decomposition on a hot day. It wasn't faint, it was a physical presence in the air that coated the back of their throats. Driven by a morbid curiosity, Liam pushed forward through a thick fernbrake and stopped. It was a doe. It lay on its side in a small clearing, its belly facing them. But it wasn't just dead. It had been methodically dismantled. Its ribcage was torn open, the ribs jutting out like the fingers of a skeleton, their broken ends white and sharp. The glistening purple and grey viscera had been pulled out, lying in a wet, chaotic heap on the forest floor. Flies buzzed, a moving, shimmering black cloud over the wound, but that wasn't the worst part. Most of the meat was still there. The attacker had not eaten much, and one of the doe's hind legs was broken, bent backwards at an angle nature never intended. It wasn't an injury from a struggle. It had been done with a cold precision, a terrible economy of violence. Liam stared, his breath caught in his chest. The forest's strange silence now had an explanation. The feeling of being watched now had a face. Chloe made a small sound, a choked sob. She backed away, her hand covering her mouth. Their arrogance had died in the parking lot. Their confidence had died when the trail vanished. Their hope had just died here, in this foul-smelling clearing. All that was left was fear, a cold and pure thing, and the knowledge that they were not just lost in a forest. They were locked in a cage with something, and that something had just shown them what it could do. The fear that followed the discovery of the doe's carcass was a tangible thing, a cold grease that coated their every thought. They weren't walking anymore, they were skulking. Every tree trunk could be something watching. Every rustle of leaves could be a footstep. Liam carried a broken branch, a pathetic, useless weapon, but its weight in his hand was a small comfort. The blister on his heel had become a sharp, throbbing pulse, and he could feel the heat of infection starting to spread. They saw it for the first time late on the third day. They were at the edge of a small clearing where a few sickly rays of light managed to penetrate the canopy. On the opposite side, perhaps 50 yards away, there was a movement. It wasn't fast. It was a shift in the texture of the forest. A patch of darkness detached itself from the other shadows. It took shape, a colossal form, a mountain of black fur and muscle. It stood on 4 legs, but its head was raised, and Liam could see, even from that distance, its wet nose testing the air. It wasn't just there by chance. It was observing them. There was no curiosity in its posture, only a cold, still appraisal. Liam froze, his breath caught in his chest. Chloe made a small, choked hiss. The beast turned its head toward them, a slow, deliberate motion. It watched them for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a sound, it stepped back, melting into the darkness of the trees and vanishing. It didn't run. It simply ceased to allow them to see it. That night, the horror turned from the physical to the psychological. They pitched their flimsy tent in a small rock alcove, a futile attempt at security. The darkness in the forest was not like city darkness. It was a solid thing, a black, absolute presence. And in that blackness, it began. First came the sound of something heavy moving, a slow, ponderous dragging sound circling their camp, always just outside the reach of their weak firelight. Then came the cracking of branches. Not the random snaps of a moving animal. These were deliberate. Crack. A period of silence. Then, from a different direction. Crack. It was marking its perimeter, reminding them they were inside its territory. Around midnight, the growling started. It wasn't a loud, angry roar. It was a low, deep rumble, a vibration in the chest they could feel through the ground. It came from deep in the beast's throat, a sound of malevolent contentment, of patience. It knew they were there. It knew they were afraid, and it was enjoying it. Chloe began to cry, silent, choked sobs muffled in her sleeping bag. Liam sat, his stick clutched in his hands, his eyes fixed on the thin nylon of the tent, the only thing separating them from the patient death waiting outside. The relief of dawn brought no hope, only exhaustion. They packed with trembling fingers and began to walk with no other purpose now than to flee. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. They just moved frantically. The chase began at midday. There was no warning, just a roar that tore the silence apart, this time a roar of action and the sound of crashing timber as it burst from the undergrowth behind them. They didn't look back. They ran. It wasn't a run. It was a panicked prey animal stampede. Fear was a cold, chemical adrenaline in their veins, pushing their bodies past the limits of endurance. Their lungs burned as if they were inhaling broken glass. Lactic acid screamed in their muscles. Branches whipped their faces, leaving bleeding red welts. Roots tripped them, but terror hauled them back to their feet. The sound of the beast's growls and heavy footfalls was right behind them, a constant rhythm of impending destruction. Liam could smell it, a rank, musky odor of fur and death. They stumbled down a scree-covered slope, sliding and tumbling in a chaotic mess of limbs and loose rock. They landed in a dry creek bed. The bear stopped at the top of the slope, let out a frustrated roar, and then turned and vanished back into the woods. For several minutes they just lay there, gasping, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. They had survived. But as the panic subsided, another cold realization crept in. Liam's pack had been torn open in the fall. Everything they had, the tent, the sleeping bags, the Swiss Army knife, the meager first aid kit, was gone. Only Chloe's tattered pack remained. After an hour of trembling rest, they dragged their bruised bodies back to where they had camped the night before, in the faint hope of salvaging something. But the campsite was gone. It had been annihilated, and that was the final, methodical horror. Their tent wasn't just knocked over, it had been shredded into thin ribbons of nylon as if by a giant set of razors. Their sleeping bags were disemboweled, the white synthetic down scattered everywhere like dirty snow. Their few remaining food packages were not eaten. They had been opened, and the contents, granola bars, packets of dried fruit, had been ground into the mud, mashed into a useless, gritty paste. Even their empty water bottles had been crushed by an unimaginable force. Liam stared at the destruction. He understood. This was not the act of a hungry animal. This was the act of a malevolent intelligence. The bear didn't just want to kill them, it was stripping them. It was peeling away their layers of civilization, one item, one hope at a time. It wasn't just hunting their bodies, it was breaking their minds. It was reducing them to naked, desperate animals just like itself before it made the final move. The forest wasn't its home, it was its torture chamber. They were trapped. The destruction of the camp was a clear message. There was nowhere to go. The bear wasn't just hunting them, it was herding them. It drove them into a small section of the forest, a steep-sided valley enclosed by impassable rock faces, with a single small stream running through it. It was their prison. The bear was the warden, a black shadow that would occasionally appear on the valley's rim, a constant reminder of their confinement. Now another enemy, an internal one, began its work. Hunger. For the first 2 days it was a sharp pang, an emptiness in the stomach. By the third day it had become a constant cramping pain, as if their own organs were trying to consume themselves. They became obsessed with food. They talked about past meals in almost pornographic detail, the texture of a steak, the saltiness of fries, the cold slide of ice cream on the tongue. These memories were a form of torture. By the 5th day, their bodies began the process of autophagy in earnest. Liam, who had prided himself on his fitness, could see his muscles wasting away. His skin grew loose. His cheekbones jutted from his gaunt face. When he stood up too quickly, his vision tunneled to a black point, and he had to grab a tree to keep from falling. Chloe was worse. She no longer bothered with her hair, and it hung around her face in a ragged, matted mess. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor as if the life was slowly draining out of it. They tried to eat, They dug up roots with their bare fingers. They tasted of bitter earth and chemicals, leaving a greasy film in their mouths. They turned over damp rocks looking for insects. Liam caught a shiny black beetle. He hesitated for a moment, then closed his eyes and put it in his mouth. The hard carapace cracked between his teeth with a brittle crunch. Inside was a sour, pasty fluid. He swallowed and fought down the wave of nausea that threatened to rise. Chloe couldn't. She just wept. Her mental breakdown ran parallel to their physical decay. Her live in harmony with nature philosophy, faced with a nature that was utterly hostile, warped into a form of madness. She began to believe the bear was a spirit guide, a test sent to purify them. "It doesn't want to hurt us," she whispered one evening, her eyes unnaturally bright in the firelight. "It's teaching us. It wants us to let go of our egos, to stop resisting." "It wants to eat us, Chloe," Liam said, his voice a raw rasp of exhaustion. "No, you don't understand," she replied, a thin, terrifying smile on her cracked lips. "You're still fighting. You have to surrender. You have to show the forest you respect it." The next day, Liam found her whispering to a tree, her hand stroking its rough bark. She refused to help him search for food. "That is an act of greed," she said. "We must wait for the forest to provide." Liam realized he wasn't just trapped with a bear, he was trapped with a stranger who was going insane. The hunger was eating their bodies, and the fear was eating her mind. They were no longer a couple. They were two separate creatures, dying in a cage, each in their own way. He looked at her, the woman he had once loved, and felt nothing but a cold distance. She had become part of the hostile forest, a liability, a danger, and when that thought surfaced for the first time, he felt no guilt. He only felt the harsh clarity of survival. The bear attacked on the 11th day. The sky was a leaden gray, threatening rain. Liam was trying to sharpen a stick with a shard of rock, a futile attempt to make a spear. Chloe was sitting several feet away, her back against a boulder. She wasn't meditating in the conventional sense. She was in a trance-like state, her eyes closed, her mouth murmuring nonsense about energy and acceptance. The bear didn't burst from the undergrowth. It walked out deliberately, like a king entering his court. It ignored Liam, who scrambled to his feet, the useless stick held out before him. It walked directly to Chloe. Chloe's eyes snapped open. For a moment, pure animal terror flashed across her face, eclipsing the madness. Her mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. The bear stood before her, its head lowered, its small, soulless black eyes staring into hers. Then it acted with a terrible precision. It didn't pounce. It didn't tear. It simply swatted her with one of its massive forepaws. The blow didn't look powerful, but the force of it threw Chloe against the rock behind her. There was a distinct dry crack as her head hit the stone. Then, before she could fall, its jaws closed over her left leg just above the knee. Liam heard the sound of the bone breaking. It wasn't a clean snap. It was a wet, gruesome grinding sound, the sound of a femur being turned to splinters between its teeth. The bear shook her once like a dog with a rag doll and then released her. She fell to the ground in a heap. And then the bear did the most horrific thing of all. It didn't eat her. It didn't drag her away. It backed up a few paces, sat down on its haunches, and watched, like a scientist observing the results of an experiment. It cocked its head, a low, satisfied rumble emanating from deep in its chest. Chloe started to scream. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a sound of unimaginable pain, a high, piercing, continuous shriek of a nervous system being destroyed. Her leg was twisted at a completely wrong angle, a pool of dark blood spreading from the wound. Liam stood there, frozen, his mind a blank slate. The bear just sat, watching, listening to the symphony of pain it had created. After 10 minutes or so, as if bored, it stood, turned lazily, and ambled back into the forest, leaving Liam alone with Chloe's screams. The screaming went on for hours. It echoed off the valley walls, an inescapable sound. Liam tried to go to her. Her eyes were rolling in agony. "Help me," she rasped. "Please, make it stop." He could do nothing. He had no painkillers, no tools. He couldn't move her. He couldn't stop the bleeding, and her screams, he knew, would just draw the bear back. She was a living bait. As night fell, Chloe's screams had weakened into a pathetic whimpering and moaning. She was dying, but slowly. Liam sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her suffering. He thought of the bear, sitting somewhere out there, listening too. A cold, cruel clarity formed in his exhausted mind. He was faced with an impossible choice. To leave her was to condemn her to more hours of agony, only to be eaten when the bear returned. Or he could make it stop, an act of cruelty, an act of mercy. He stopped thinking. He acted. He searched in the darkness until his hands closed around a heavy, smooth stone, the size of a small melon. He walked over to Chloe. She stopped moaning as he approached, her eyes in the gloom looking at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "Liam," she whispered. He didn't answer. He knelt beside her, lifting the rock in both hands. Its weight was solid, real. He closed his eyes. He didn't think about Chloe. He thought about the sound. He just wanted the sound to stop. He brought the rock down. There was a wet, solid sound, a muffled crack, not like bone breaking, but like a melon being smashed. The impact jarred his arms, and then silence, an absolute, perfect silence. Liam opened his eyes. He let the rock fall from his hands. He did not look at what he had done. He just listened to the silence. It was beautiful. In that silence, the man named Liam died. Something else, something emptier and more efficient, was born. Liam felt nothing, no guilt, no grief, no horror, just an emptiness, a cold clarity. He had been in this forest for 12 days. Fear had not helped. Hope had not helped. Compassion had not helped. All those things were baggage. Now he was light. All that remained was a single blade-pure purpose. Survive. No, not just survive. Kill. He spent the night sitting in the darkness beside the body. The next morning, a new, more practical hunger took him. He looked at the corpse. It was no longer Chloe. It was meat. It was protein. It was energy. He had seen how the bear did not eat its kill immediately. He had learned that lesson. The act was without ceremony. He used the sharp rock shard he had been trying to fashion into a spear. He cut a piece of flesh from the intact thigh. The work was difficult. The cold skin was tough. The muscle was stiff. He worked methodically like a man butchering an animal. When he was done, he built a small fire and cooked the meat. The smell rose, a familiar and utterly grotesque odor. But he ate. He chewed mechanically, swallowed, and felt the energy, a warm strength, spread through his depleted body. He had become a beast, feeding on his own kind to survive. He had crossed the final threshold. With the new energy, he began to prepare. He was no longer running, he was hunting. He sharpened his stick patiently, grinding the point on a stone until it was arrow-sharp. He smeared himself with mud and crushed leaves, a primal camouflage to mask his human scent. He began to move through the forest, not as a victim, but as a predator. He thought like the bear. He looked for its signs, the claw marks on trees, the prints in the mud, the scat filled with fur and bone. He was mirroring his enemy. He tracked it to a cliff face at the edge of the valley. Hidden behind a curtain of vines was a dark fissure. A thick, foul stench emanated from it. The bear's lair. He didn't rush in, he waited. He hid in a nearby thicket, the spear clutched in his hand, perfectly still for hours. He had learned patience from the bear. Dusk fell, and the beast returned. It moved lazily, smugly, unaware. As it neared the entrance to its lair, Liam acted. He burst from his hiding place, not with a yell, but with a silent, ruthless focus. The bear turned, surprised, but it was fast. It rose up on its hind legs, a tower of fur and muscle, and let out a furious roar. It swiped. Liam dodged, but its razor-sharp claws still tore a flap of skin and muscle from his shoulder. The pain was white-hot, but he ignored it. He lunged, putting his entire body weight behind the spear. The point drove into the animal's side, just below its foreleg. He felt a terrible resistance as it pierced the thick hide and muscle, then a dry crack as it met a rib. The bear roared in pain and fury. It did not fall. It clamped its jaws on the spear, snapping it easily. It lunged for Liam, knocking him onto his back. Its foul breath was hot on his face. Its teeth were inches from his throat. In that last panicked moment, Liam's hand scrabbled on the ground and found it, the sharp rock he had used before. Without thinking, he thrust upward, aiming for the soft spot under the bear's chin. The rock shard drove deep into the animal's throat. There was a wet, gurgling sound. Hot, thick blood erupted, drenching Liam. The bear convulsed, trying to roar but only making a hideous choking noise. Its strength began to fail. It collapsed, its immense weight crushing Liam beneath it. It twitched a few more times and then was still. Liam lay under the dead weight of the beast, gasping for breath, soaked in his own blood and the blood of his enemy. He had won. He didn't know how long he pushed the carcass off himself and staggered away. He walked without direction, a wounded automaton. His shoulder was a burning agony. His body was a map of bruises and cuts, but he kept going, and then he stumbled. Not on a root. He stumbled out of the tree line and his face hit something hard, hot and acrid. Asphalt. He raised his head. He was on a road, a 2-lane blacktop. A white pickup truck with the logo of the Park Service on its door was approaching. It slowed, then stopped. A large, overweight man in a uniform got out. His face was a mask of shock and horror. "Good God Almighty," the ranger said. "Son, what happened to you?" He tried to help Liam up. Liam flinched away. He looked at this man, soft, clean, unscarred, with a potbelly. He smelled of coffee and donuts. It was alien, it was weak. The ranger offered him a bottle of water and a chocolate bar. "Here, take this." Liam looked at the chocolate bar, wrapped in its colorful foil, a processed food, a food of the old world. Then he looked up, past the ranger's shoulder, and stared back at the wall of green he had just emerged from. He could smell it, the scent of rot and blood and silence. He did not take the chocolate bar. He turned his face away from the man. His eyes, which no longer reflected light but only absorbed it, stared into the forest. They were not the eyes of a rescued graphic designer. They were the eyes of the only animal that had walked out of that lair alive. The trail had been reddened, and it had reddened his soul.